Must be spooky season. How do you do, folks? My name is Brazos Buck, and I'm your host for a series of haunting, hair-raising, spine-tingling, breath on the back of your neck. What is that? Stories out of Brazoria County and along the coastline here in the illustrious state of Texas. Now, for those of you at home, out of your Pandora boxes or those newfangled gadgets you call computadoras, be sure to follow us here at the Freeport Historical Museum and Visitor Center. Thank you, and enjoy.
The Devil of Old Velasco is a tale from the late 19th century where we meet a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey. Jeffrey was known around Old Velasco for his vast knowledge of the region, and on one blustery evening, as our boy Jeffrey enjoyed a warm cider in the local tavern, two strangers, dressed in rubberized raincoats and high boots, approached Jeffrey and introduced themselves. After exchanging pleasantries, the two strangers, with their burnt faces, bloodshot eyes, and matted hair, grilled Jeffrey on his knowledge of the local history. Jeffrey regaled them with stories of the Battle of Fort Velasco, of shipwrecks along the Brazos and San Bernard rivers, and of coastal treasures lost to time and memory. The two strangers turned to one another slowly, and then back to Jeffrey. "We are looking for the treasure of the pirate Jean Lafitte. We'll pay you handsomely if you escort us and help us retrieve it." Jeffrey turned with a smile to see one of the strangers flashing him a billfold. Times were tough in Old Velasco, and hurricane season was drawing near. The full moon sliced through the haze of mist as Jeffrey and the two strangers carried shovels down the beach. The smell of salt water and something rotting was thick in the air that night. Jeffrey knew the general proximity based on local legend, but skepticism kept him from ever pursuing Lafitte's gold. The stories of hidden treasures were abundant. It was always an errand of dreamers and madmen, and Jeffrey knew it would take several hours, if not days, to locate their prize. But the strangers assured him of his concerns. As the hours passed into early morning, and the moon yellowed in color, the three men dug through layers of dirt and shell, occasionally pulling up old iron cannonballs from wars past. When finally, Jeffrey's shovel struck something solid, something big. The two strangers pushed Jeffrey aside as they grasped at what appeared to be an iron trunk, oxidized from all its years hidden, forgotten for a reason. The two strangers were elated, and they grasped on each side of the trunk while Jeffrey continued to sit in shock. As the two strangers pulled up on the handles, the iron chest began to glow red and burning hot. The ground beneath them rumbled and opened up. Out spewed boiling ocean water, hot embers, and ash. Jeffrey screamed as a large, burnt hand reached up from out of the ground and pulled the chest down into the earth, pulling with it the two strangers in their raincoats. Sprinting down the beach in the direction of Galveston, Jeffrey screamed and screamed and screamed, "It was the devil! It was the devil! It was the devil!" To this day in Old Velasco, in the modern town of Surfside, when the tide is high, the moon is yellow, and hurricane season approaches, you can still hear poor Jeffrey screaming.
This next story is quite tragic. In fact, you may want to hold your loved ones a little bit closer.
Theodosia Burr Alston was the daughter of Aaron Burr, once the Vice President of the United States. In July of 1812, after a 4-year exile for his duel with Alexander Hamilton, Burr had returned from Europe to his home in New York. Burr longed to see his daughter, Theodosia. When Theodosia received the letter from her father to come visit, there was no joy, no excitement. She had just lost her 10-year-old son, named Aaron after her father, to malaria. With her husband, Joseph Alston, recently sworn in as governor of South Carolina, Theodosia sat on her silk-upholstered couch, staring longingly out of the window of her home. Wearing a white linen dress and a gold locket around her neck, she tightly gripped her son's lead toy soldiers. Theodosia mourned alone. It wasn't until December that Theodosia could build up the strength and commitment to travel by sea, up the Atlantic from South Carolina, to see her father Aaron. As Theodosia's husband was also the head of the state militia, he would be unable to accompany her. A family friend would go in his place. Theodosia stood briefly at the bow of the schooner Patriot before leaving port. She watched as the water gently slapped the hull of the schooner and swayed side to side with the current. Theodosia mourned alone. As the schooner Patriot sailed the winter Atlantic waters, another ship emerged out of the morning fog with sinister intentions. The Patriot and its passengers came under attack by pirates. The schooner Patriot never made it to its destination. Theodosia sat chained in the hull of a strange ship, on board with strange men. And as the ship embarked for another course, perhaps south, Theodosia lamented and grieved for all that she had and all that she lost. Sitting in her white linen dress, she held on to one of her son's lead toy soldiers. While the pirates had pillaged most of her belongings, Theodosia would not let them have this. In the spring of 1813, after a series of storms battered the coast of Tejas, a warrior of the Karankawa explored the fresh ruins of a ship that had washed ashore at the mouth of a river that the Spaniards, he remembered, called San Bernard. The warrior was extremely tall. He wore a buckskin breechclout, and on his head he wore a collection of feathers. The warrior's body was covered in tattoos, oil, and piercings of cane that he wore proudly. As he pulled away a large, tattered piece of canvas, the Karankawa warrior saw a small woman in a torn, white dress who stood almost lifeless, chained to a section of the wrecked ship. They studied each other until the small woman collapsed, the Karankawa warrior catching her in his arms. In the palm of her hand was a lead toy soldier, and around her neck was a gold locket engraved with the name Theodosia. Splayed open, the locket revealed a portrait of what appeared to be a mother and a child. Theodosia looked up at the tall warrior with a faint smile. He stared blankly back at her as the small woman drew her last breath, and the color in her cheeks faded as the breeze caught the salt water. The warrior mourned for the stranger, alone. Stories have been told of sightings at the mouth of the San Bernard, of a small woman in her tattered white dress. Local fishermen have tried to approach her to provide assistance, only for her to turn, looking in the direction of home, and fade away in the June breeze.
There are two things that Texans hate: mosquitoes and hogs. And for one father and son, they're going to have more than they could bargain for. It was September, after a hurricane had blown through a week earlier, and Randy and his son Tristan spent the day hunting. Later that evening, they'd laid on their bellies, waiting. It was late. The moon was full, and they knew that at any moment, the feral hogs would return to tear up their property.
Remember, son, when you see them hogs to breathe, aim behind the ear and pull that trigger.
Dad, I know,
complained Tristan. Randy smiled, laid his rifle to the side, and knocked the brim of his son's cap down over his face. They chuckled quietly, almost too loudly, as snorts and squeals could be heard in the distance. Any moment now, son. Be ready, Randy assured Tristan as he studied the land through the scope of his rifle. The moon was full. The hogs would be spotted easily. Finally, a giant black boar grunted his way through tall grass in the distance, followed by a litter of wild piglets. Good Lord, Randy whispered. Several more large, feral hogs shrieked their way through, tearing up the pasture with countless litters behind them. Take aim, Tristan. When I fire, you go ahead and open up on them. As Randy aimed down the sight, his finger beginning to squeeze the trigger, a blood-curdling scream came from the giant boar. Through the sight, Randy saw something large biting down on the wild hog. The rest scattered wildly into the dark. "Dad!" Tristan screamed as something large began to rise out of the tall grass, the giant boar hanging dead and limp in its mouth. Tristan fired his rifle almost at the same time that his father reached over to try and stop him. Tristan missed. They stared at each other in bewilderment as the creature continued to rise out of the grass, his eyes reflecting green in the moonlight and staring straight at them. Its head was elongated, its shoulders broad and stooped. Its arms were massive and tall. He was built like a man, but taller than anyone Randy or Tristan had ever seen. Suddenly, the creature ripped the hog apart with its large hand the way a person would eat a chicken leg. Its eyes blinked, still reflecting green in the moonlight, the same way a cat's would in the dark as the sounds of bones and meat crunching echoed across the pasture. Randy and Tristan sat in fear with rifles raised, no doubt in their mind that the creature, whatever it was fixed on them. But it stood there, silhouetted by the moonlight, and enjoying a midnight snack in such a similar way as Randy often found himself doing, standing, chewing, and gazing into nothing. As quickly as it had arrived, the creature shrugged, looked around, looked back at Randy and Tristan, and walked away. It had the gait and stride of something determined, its arms swinging at its sides. "Dad!" "Shh!" The creature turned once more, its green eyes blinking in the moonlight, studying the father and son in the dark. They weren't a threat, and Randy realized, at least at that moment, neither was it. "What was that, Dad?" Tristan asked shakingly as the creature disappeared through the large oak trees. "Son, as much as he hated that hog, he must have been a Texan." Sightings of Sasquatch, also known as Bigfoot, are still reported to this day all across North America. An October 31st, 2002 article in the Houston Chronicle recalled one such sighting in the Lake Jackson area. It is fair to say, there are a great deal of things that go bump in the night when the stars are bright, deep in the heart of Texas. The beautiful San Bernard River flows 120 miles near New Ulm, Texas, to the Gulf of Mexico. As the river crosses between Sweeney and Brazoria, the river begins to flow silently as ospreys snatch fish out of the water and herons dart across the sky. Though majestic in its appearance, the waters of the San Bernard River is notorious for its stories of ghosts, murders, shipwrecks, and slave trading. One evening, as the moon shined bright in the San Bernard, a recently widowed man named Douglas paddled his way down the calm waters. An urn containing the ashes of his wife Anne sat in the canoe in front of him alongside his old fiddle. Under the same moon and river for which they met, Douglas planned on a simple ceremony in remembrance of his sweet wife. He would spread her ashes in the river and play their favorite tune on his fiddle. As Douglas reached a spot on the river he was content with, he looked up into the night sky, admired the stars, smiled back up at the moon, and whispered his goodbyes as the ashes of his wife drifted and faded into the river. Pleased, Douglas lifted his fiddle to his chest. It was at that moment that an old fiddle tune, one that Douglas recognized as commemorating some ancient battle, began to strike up from across the river. Suddenly, a cloud of mist formed, and out of that mist popped a pair of legs in white trousers, dancing across the water. The legs built up into the rigid form of a skeleton, dressed in a fine tailcoat, playing the fiddle passionately. The fiddler of the San Bernard played joyfully, dancing and skipping towards Douglas. Taken aback, the old man looked on in terror. Was this a sign of his old age? Was this a sign?
What in tarnation?
The ghostly fiddler stopped in front of Douglas's boat and bowed. Douglas nodded in return, and at the same moment that the fiddler raised his instrument, Douglas raised his. And together, on the San Bernard, the man and the apparition played together. They celebrated life and death. They celebrated together. James Britton Bailey was done with people, and for the most part, people were done with him. As Britt Bailey lay dying of cholera inside of his home on Bailey's Prairie, the old man was ready for one more swig from his whiskey jug. A Kentucky-born veteran of the War of 1812 and participant of the recent Battle of Fort Velasco, Bailey was well known for his hot temper, his penchant for cruel pranks on neighbors and strangers, and his burning love for whiskey. His wife Nancy would not let him carry those tendencies into the afterlife. Bailey's last will and testament was signed. Bailey laid in bed, content that his final wishes would be faithfully carried out when his spirit left its mortal coil. In his will, Bailey requested that he be buried vertically, upright, to have my remains interred erect with my face fronting the west. No man would stand over Britt Bailey. Instead, there Britt Bailey would stand for eternity, facing west, facing forward. His rifle, bag and horn, a lantern, and his ever-faithful jug of whiskey would be buried alongside him to join him in the afterlife. Bailey joked that he wanted his hunting dog alongside him as well, but alas, his wife Nancy would not allow it. On December 6, 1832, Bailey died. As per his wishes, Bailey was buried upright, wearing his bag and horn, his rifle by his side, and a lantern at his feet facing west. But as old Bailey was lowered into the ground, he was without his whiskey jug. Bailey had drank his fill, and Nancy would not let him carry his bad tendencies with him into the afterlife. Without that jug of whiskey, though, Bailey never crossed over to the other side. Between the towns of Angleton and West Columbia, there have been dozens of sightings of the ghost of Britt Bailey since the 1800s. Some have seen Bailey, lantern in hand, passing through the prairies in search of his jug of whiskey. Others simply catch the light of his lantern as he frantically searches. Other reports show that Britt Bailey is still up to his cruel pranks, often scaring those driving down Highway 35 at night.
Making my way downtown, walking fast, faces passing, I'm homebound.
One thing is for sure, Britt Bailey remains one of the things that go bump in the night when the stars are bright, deep in the heart of Texas. One evening, as the moon shined bright on the San Bernard River, a young man by the name of David paddled his way down the calm waters. An urn containing the ashes of his father Douglas sat in the canoe in front of him, alongside his father's old fiddle. Under the same moon and river for which his parents met, David planned on a simple ceremony in remembrance of his recently departed father. He would spread his ashes in the river, just as his father had done to honor David's mother years before. As David reached a spot on the river that he was content with, he looked up into the night sky, admired the stars, smiled back up at the moon, and whispered his goodbyes as the ashes of his father drifted and faded into the river. David gripped his father's fiddle to his chest, disappointed that he had never learned how to play the old instrument. It was at that moment that an old fiddle tune, one that David recognized as commemorating some ancient battle, began to strike up from across the river. Suddenly, a cloud of mist formed, and out of that mist popped a pair of legs in white trousers, dancing across the water. The legs built up into the rigid form of a skeleton, dressed in a fine tailcoat, playing the fiddle passionately. The fiddler of the San Bernard played joyfully, dancing and skipping towards David. Taken aback, the young man looked on in terror. Was this the same apparition his father had spoken so fondly of? David didn't believe in stories of ghosts and apparitions. To him, they were just yarns, tall tales his father would spin to entertain David and his siblings when they were younger. The ghostly fiddler stopped in front of David's boat and bowed. David nodded in return, and at the same moment that the fiddler raised his instrument to play, David lifted his father's fiddle to his chest. Suddenly, something strange, something ethereal, possessed David's hands and fingers to strike up and play alongside the ghostly fiddler. And on the San Bernard River, the young man and the apparition played passionately. They celebrated life and death. They celebrated together. Today, haunting tales continue to abound from the San Bernard River of lost maidens, pirates, murders, and more. But some say, if you listen closely, you can still hear the fiddler playing. A decade or so after the establishment of East Columbia in 1823, a husband and wife moved into a newly constructed home along the bustling community of Bell's Landing on the Brazos River. The ladies of the town greeted and welcomed their new neighbors. husband was warm and inviting, his wife seemed cold and distant. Sensing the awkwardness in the air, the ladies left after exchanging pleasantries. Courteous as they were, the ladies returned a few more times to coax the wife into joining them in community activities. But she remained uninterested. The lady in the gray taffeta dress stood, gazing out of the window. The ladies of the town finally decided they had done what they could to welcome their new neighbor and left. The wife, always wearing the same dress made of gray silk taffeta, would be seen walking through town running errands, but always aloof. She seemed distracted, distant. The ladies of Bell's Landing were surprised when they learned that the home was up for sale. Had they been awful neighbors? Did they neglect them? They approached the young couple again, only to find out that the husband had sent his wife back home to the east, as she was unable to adapt to life in Texas. Eventually, the house was sold. The husband moved on, and Thomas Jefferson Sweeney's family moved in. Thus, the home once occupied by the young couple became known as the Sweeney House. The Sweeney House was thoroughly cleaned, inspected, and prepared for the Planter family when a grisly discovery was made. The lady in the gray taffeta dress was given a Christian burial, and the people of Bell's Landing had no way of enforcing justice for the young woman. There was no doubt it must have been her husband who murdered her. Time had passed, and the Sweeney's niece and nephew, Musetta and Henry, came to live with their aunt and uncle to attend school. Unaware of the disturbing murder that occurred there, Musetta and Henry always felt uneasy staying in that house. Every opportunity they had, the brother and sister spent time outside and would call upon their aunt when they were ready to head back inside. One cold winter afternoon, Musetta and Henry entered the house and called for their aunt. There was no response, when suddenly... In the cold Texas winter, Musetta and Henry ran all the way to their parents' plantation home, 11 miles away in the present-day town of Sweeney, Texas. The original Sweeney house at Bell's Landing no longer stands today, but numerous haunted tales were recorded by Catherine Munson Foster as originating from that area. Her iconic book, Ghosts Along the Brazos, remains a staple in libraries and homes today. It is believed that the spirits still wander around the old homes at Bell's Landing in East Columbia, ready to scare again. Perhaps the lady in the gray taffeta dress is somewhere there, waiting for her husband to return, just so she can wring his neck.
Wow, that's a cool house.
Wow.
Wow.
Wow.